April 1945. Southern Germany lay under a gray, broken sky. The war was nearly over, though no one in the camp dared to say it aloud. Barbed wire sagged under rain, the mud thick with the weight of surrender. Inside the compound, a row of German women, former clerks, nurses, radio operators, stood motionless, their Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht insignias stripped from their sleeves. They had served the Reich in offices and bunkers, believing in its power, in its permanence. But that belief was gone now, scattered like the smoke from distant bombed towns. Then came the sound. Engines, steady and powerful, approaching from beyond the hills. A convoy rolled through the camp gates, olive-drab trucks with white stars painted on their doors. The women tensed, expecting American soldiers to emerge. Instead, what stepped down stopped them cold. Women. American women. Confident, poised, their uniforms pressed, their movements sure. One adjusted her cap and gave orders to the men beside her. Another leaned casually against the truck, lighting a cigarette. Their voices carried authority, their faces unafraid. The German prisoners stared, struggling to reconcile what they were seeing. Women commanding men speaking freely, laughing softly amid the wreckage of war. In that silent shock, something deeper than defeat began to settle. It wasn't just the Reich that had fallen. It was everything they had been taught to believe about womanhood, power, and freedom. Before the war, the German ideal of womanhood was crafted like a weapon, beautiful, obedient, and silent. The Nazi regime had made it clear. A woman's battlefield was the home, her duty to bear children, nurture soldiers, and serve the state's vision of purity. Propaganda posters showed women smiling beside cradles and plows, slogans glorifying motherhood as the front behind the front. Even those who served in uniform did so under the same rigid expectation: helpers, not equals. The Helferinnen, as they were called, worked in communications, clerical offices, or air defense command posts, but they were bound by the same invisible chains of submission. They were not soldiers. They were instruments of obedience dressed in gray wool. By 1944, the war had begun to devour that illusion. Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombings, fuel shortages, and a war it could no longer sustain. Women were pulled into every corner of the war machine, operating flak batteries, decoding messages, treating the wounded in field hospitals, and even manning anti-aircraft guns as the front lines moved closer to home. The Reich that had once preached feminine fragility now demanded endurance. Yet the same regime that relied on their labor denied them dignity. They were praised as symbols but treated as tools. Their loyalty was rewarded not with respect but with sacrifice. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the story was different. America's entry into the war had sparked a mobilization unlike anything the world had seen. Between 1941 and 1945, over 350,000 women joined the U.S. Armed Forces. They became the Women's Army Corps, the Waves of the Navy, the Spars of the Coast Guard, and the Women Air Force Service pilots. The WASPs. These were not symbols. They were soldiers. They wore uniforms, earned ranks, and performed duties critical to the Allied war effort. American factories thrummed with the sound of female hands assembling tanks, planes, and artillery. While German propaganda painted them as immoral or reckless, the truth was far more powerful. They were efficient, organized, and unafraid. The Women's Army Corps, led by Oveta Kulp-Hobby, had become a cornerstone of Allied logistics. Women drove convoys through England, decoded intercepted messages, operated switchboards, and managed communications across the European theater. They handled weapons shipments, medical logistics, and personnel records that sustained millions of soldiers. Their professionalism was undeniable. General Dwight Eisenhower once remarked that he could not have won the war without them. To the German women who were raised in a culture that confined them to obedience, this was inconceivable. Nazi ideology had declared the liberation of women a Western decay, proof of moral collapse. In speeches and films, Joseph Goebbels ridiculed the idea of women in uniform as unnatural and disgraceful. The message was clear. The Allied nations had sacrificed their virtue for equality, while Germany had preserved its strength through order. But that illusion began to shatter when Allied troops crossed the Rhine. As the U.S. Army advanced into the heart of Germany, it brought with it a force the Reich had never anticipated: women who led, commanded, and served as equals. They drove ambulances through artillery zones, staffed field hospitals near the front, and supervised logistics hubs that stretched from Normandy to Bavaria. The American women were calm and capable, their confidence built on competence rather than privilege. For the German captives who witnessed them, it was disorienting. In the early spring of 1945, thousands of female auxiliaries were captured in the field. They were Luftwaffe typists, communications clerks, and Red Cross volunteers who had followed the army into occupied territories. Many had been indoctrinated since adolescence through the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, taught that their greatest virtue was obedience and their purpose service to the nation's men. When captured, they expected humiliation or punishment. Instead, they were treated with professionalism by Allied personnel, many of whom were women. It was this quiet, everyday dignity that shook them most deeply. Reports from POW camps in Belgium and Western Germany described the astonishment of captured German women when processed by American female officers. Some refused to speak, others wept, unable to reconcile the reality before them. Here were women giving orders to men, commanding respect without aggression, and carrying themselves with ease. It was not dominance that defined them, but freedom, the kind of freedom born of equality. The contrast ran deeper than military structure. In the United States, the war had redefined gender roles from necessity. When millions of men went to fight overseas, women filled the factories, the laboratories, and the offices that kept the nation running. In the skies, the Wasps ferried aircraft from factories to combat zones, often flying the same planes the men took into battle. In medicine, women served as surgeons and nurses close to the front lines. The concept of shared responsibility was embedded in the Allied effort. Every capable hand mattered regardless of gender. Germany, on the other hand, had resisted that shift. Even as the war worsened, the Nazi leadership struggled to accept women in non-domestic roles. Hitler himself had declared that a woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. By 1945, the absurdity of that belief was exposed. The Reich's reliance on women for survival contradicted its own ideology. They had become the invisible backbone of a crumbling system, working, sacrificing, dying, yet still denied recognition. This ideological clash became most visible when these two worlds met face to face. When German auxiliaries conditioned to submission encountered the confident stride of American women, the effect was more than cultural shock. It was existential. It wasn't just that the Americans had won the war. They had also won the argument about what women could be. In occupied German towns, Allied women became a symbol of the new world taking shape. They patrolled streets with discipline, staffed command posts, and distributed food and medicine. They walked freely, unafraid of authority. To the defeated population, especially to women, this was a revelation. The confidence in their posture, the way they spoke to male officers without hesitation, was something no German woman had been taught to imagine. It wasn't arrogance, it was normalcy. For the German women captives, this normalcy was the hardest part to comprehend. They had spent years under propaganda that declared independence a threat, ambition a sin, and now in defeat, they stood face to face with women whose strength came not from ideology but from opportunity. The war had stripped away the illusion of superiority, and what remained was the truth. Freedom had given the Allies a power that the Reich could never replicate. That realization spread quietly through the camps and villages, carried in glances and whispers. It was not the noise of propaganda but the calm certainty of example that broke the old beliefs. The women who had once believed in the perfection of their nation now began to see that confidence and respect were not gifts from authority. They were earned through equality. And it was in that quiet, stunned recognition that the true transformation began. It was a shock far deeper than defeat. It was the awakening of comparison. They had been taught to pity Western women. Now they envied them, and as the smoke of war thinned across Europe, that realization would become one of the quiet revolutions of the post-war world. A revolution born not in battlefields or speeches, but in the gaze of captives watching other women walk freely across the ruins of history. In the days following surrender, the landscape of occupied Germany looked like a world stripped of certainty. Bridges hung broken over rivers, cities were reduced to hollow shells, and trains carried streams of displaced people searching for somewhere that still felt human. Inside this chaos, in camps and requisitioned schools turned into processing centers, the stories of captured German women unfolded quietly. They had expected punishment, some even humiliation. Instead, they found themselves in an environment unlike anything the Reich had prepared them for. There were rules, structure, and authority, but there was also something else: respect. And that respect came more often than not from women wearing American uniforms. The first encounters were awkward and tense. German Helferinnen, who had spent years serving in the shadow of men, struggled to understand the confidence of their captors. The American WWII and Red Cross officers who handled registration, interrogation, and care walked with the same authority as their male counterparts. Their tone was calm, their words measured, their gestures professional. They were neither cruel nor deferential. To German eyes, conditioned to hierarchy and subservience, this balance was unsettling. Here were women who neither sought permission nor dominance, they simply acted. That in itself was revolutionary. Across Europe, similar moments played out in hundreds of camps and military outposts. In France, Belgium, and Germany, American women directed logistics, oversaw supply routes, and commanded male soldiers. German captives, especially women, often stared in disbelief. It was strange, one former Luftwaffe clerk later recalled. They looked at us not with contempt but with pity. We could not meet their eyes. That pity came not from arrogance, but from contrast, from seeing women broken by a system that had denied them equality. The contrast deepened when German captives saw how Allied women were treated by their own men. In the Reich, even female officers were rarely saluted or acknowledged as equals. They existed in service to authority, not alongside it. In the Allied ranks, women were part of the command chain. Male soldiers deferred to them when required, followed their orders in the field, and protected their authority. The balance of respect was clear. It was earned by competence, not gender. That difference shook the German women more than any interrogation could. Nazi propaganda had taught them that democracy weakened nations by blurring the lines of discipline and morality. Women in the West, they were told, were frivolous, consumed by vanity and immorality. Yet standing in front of them were women whose strength was quiet but absolute. They spoke freely. They made decisions. And they did so with the authority of a nation that had triumphed, not just militarily but ideologically. American women were not the only ones challenging perceptions. In the British sector, members of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, worked side by side with male officers, driving convoys, managing radar stations, and operating anti-aircraft batteries during the war. In the Soviet East, female snipers and tank crews had proven their mettle in the bloodiest fighting on Earth. By 1945, the idea of women in command was no longer a fantasy. It was reality across the Allied world. But for the German captives, this reality was new and destabilizing. The psychological weight of this realization was profound. Many of the women had joined the Nazi auxiliaries out of duty or survival, not ideology. Yet their training had reinforced a sense of feminine inferiority cloaked as virtue. They were told they were the keepers of purity, the mothers of soldiers, the supporters of greatness. The war had destroyed that illusion. Now they were face to face with women who embodied a different creed, one built on freedom, competence, and confidence. In one camp outside Aachen, American WWII officers were tasked with processing hundreds of German female POWs. The reports describe an atmosphere of stunned silence as the prisoners observed their captors. One German nurse later wrote in her diary that she had never imagined a woman giving orders to men, and the men obeying without question. To her, it felt like witnessing the future. The American women who carried out these duties did not see themselves as symbols. They were soldiers performing their tasks, organizing paperwork, coordinating supplies, treating the wounded. Yet their presence alone became a message. They represented a society where women were trusted with responsibility, not sheltered from it. In the ruins of a country that had worshipped power, that trust seemed like the most powerful thing of all. In Munich, captured female radio operators were assigned to assist Allied translators in sorting German documents. They worked under the supervision of both male and female officers, something unheard of in their previous world. A German operator named Erika later recounted in an interview how surreal it felt. The American women were direct, always speaking to men as equals. We had been trained to lower our eyes, to wait to be spoken to. They did not wait. They decided. It was not only a cultural revelation but a moral one. In conversations with American Red Cross personnel, some of the captured women expressed disbelief that their captors treated them kindly, offering medical care and food despite the destruction Germany had caused. Many of these American women had brothers or husbands who had fought, some who had died, yet they showed no cruelty. The discipline of empathy was something the Reich had never taught. The difference between propaganda and reality became undeniable. Nazi films had portrayed American women as reckless, corrupt, or broken by freedom. But in the camps and ruined towns, the German women saw something else. Dignity born of self-assurance. Freedom had not destroyed them. It had defined them. Their strength was not in submission, but in choice. For many captives, the experience forced a private reckoning. Letters written in the months after the surrender reveal an undercurrent of quiet admiration. They were not afraid to speak, wrote one former auxiliary to a friend. Their confidence was not arrogance, but something we did not understand. Perhaps it is what they call liberty. This was not admiration for an enemy, it was the beginning of transformation. For the German women who would later rebuild their nation, these encounters became an invisible turning point. They had seen what equality looked like in action. They had witnessed women being trusted, respected, and valued for their skill. It was a truth that could not be unlearned. For the Americans, these interactions were often matter of fact. Few saw themselves as part of a cultural shift. They were exhausted, doing their duty in a devastated land, unaware that their very presence was reshaping the consciousness of those who watched them. Yet history would prove that their influence was lasting. In the broader Allied command, leaders recognized the significance of women's roles in victory. General Eisenhower publicly credited the efficiency of female personnel in maintaining supply chains and intelligence. Oveta Culp-Hobby, the WWII director, received the Distinguished Service Medal for organizing a force that had become essential to operations in Europe. These were not symbolic acknowledgments. They were recognition of necessity turned into progress. Meanwhile, in Germany, the images of American and British women working confidently in occupied cities began to circulate quietly among civilians. In the black markets and ration lines, whispers spread. The Americans let their women lead. For some, it was scandalous. For others, it was inspiring. Even those who resented the occupiers could not deny the reality before them. The confidence of these women, their posture, their tone, their unguarded laughter, seemed to belong to another species of human altogether. To women raised under dictatorship, it was like seeing sunlight for the first time. For the younger generation of German girls, especially those coming of age in the ruins, this image would linger. They would remember the women in khaki uniforms who spoke freely and smiled without fear. In time, they would ask questions their mothers had never dared to ask. The Allies' victory had been military, political, and moral, but it was also cultural. The sight of women in command, walking through the rubble with purpose, became a subtle declaration. The new world would not be built on obedience, but on equality. And for the women behind the wire, who watched it happen, from within the ruins of their own empire, it was both humbling and liberating. For the first time, they could see what freedom looked like, not as an abstract idea, but as a woman walking confidently through the dust of defeat. It was a revelation more enduring than surrender papers, and it marked the beginning of a new kind of reconstruction, one not of cities but of minds. It was early May 1945 when the last German lines collapsed. The war that had consumed a continent was over, and from the Baltic to the Alps, millions of prisoners flooded Allied custody. Among them were tens of thousands of women, clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, secretaries, the human machinery that had kept the Reich functioning long after its soul had burned away. They arrived at makeshift camps built in fields and schoolyards, carrying small bags, clutching identification papers, many still in partial uniform. Some wept openly, others stared blankly ahead, numb with disbelief. But among the Americans processing them, there was no celebration, just order, discipline, and a quiet efficiency that seemed to contrast painfully with the chaos of the fallen empire. In one camp near Kassel, the processing tables were run by American WACs. They wore khaki uniforms, their hair tied neatly beneath their caps, clipboards in hand. Each prisoner was recorded, searched and assigned to barracks. When the first group of German women was let in, they stopped short. It wasn't the American men who unsettled them. It was the women. Calm, confident, and utterly self-assured, they gave instructions in firm, neutral voices. Next group. Move forward. Their authority carried the weight of an army, not as borrowed power but as their own. The German women hesitated, glancing at one another, unsure how to respond. No one had told them what to do when the person giving orders was another woman. A Luftwaffe telegrapher in the group, barely 20 years old, later recalled the moment. They looked at us directly, not down on us, not up to us, just straight. It made me feel small in a way I had never felt before, not from fear but from realization. For many, this was the first time they had encountered women who stood on equal ground with men, not by ideology but by conduct. The Americans did not apologize for their authority, nor flaunt it. It was normal, practiced, and natural. That was what made it so powerful. Elsewhere, in the ruins of Munich, a group of captured female clerks from the propaganda ministry was assigned to assist American logistics officers in cataloging seized documents. They worked under the supervision of a young WWII lieutenant. The German women expected arrogance, perhaps cruelty. Instead, they found professionalism, a woman who balanced authority with kindness, who listened, instructed, and corrected without humiliation. One of the prisoners, Helga, later wrote in a post-war letter, "We had been told American women were frivolous and immoral. But she was none of that. She was disciplined, educated, respected by the men around her. It was then I realized we had been lied to about everything. The moment of reckoning came not with violence or punishment, but with example. In the hierarchy of war, the American women stood outside propaganda. They were real, undeniable, and free." In the following weeks, word spread across camps and occupied towns of female Allied officers inspecting facilities, leading supply convoys, or supervising the distribution of rations. To the defeated German women, these images were jarring. Here were women walking side by side with male soldiers, their voices carrying over the sound of engines, their movements purposeful and unguarded. They did not seek permission, they gave direction. The social structure that had defined Germany for generations was dissolving before their eyes. The psychological impact deepened when female POWs were assigned to assist in civilian relief efforts. In one instance near Frankfurt, American nurses and WWII officers coordinated the evacuation of displaced civilians, including captured German auxiliaries, from bombed neighborhoods. The German women watched as American soldiers followed the instructions of their female counterparts without question. It defied everything they had been taught about hierarchy, obedience, and gender. Some reacted with resentment. Years of indoctrination could not be erased overnight. A few dismissed the Americans as mannish, claiming that freedom had made them unfeminine. But those voices grew quieter with each passing day. The truth was visible in every interaction. Freedom had not made these women less. It had made them more. There were other encounters, more intimate and human, that revealed the emotional depth of this cultural collision. One American Red Cross nurse, stationed in a temporary hospital near Nuremberg, described treating German female prisoners for malnutrition and frostbite. Many were young and barely out of adolescence. She remembered one woman bursting into tears when handed clean bandages and coffee. She kept saying, "I don't understand why you help me," the nurse wrote. And I told her, "Because it's the right thing to do." She looked at me as if I had spoken another language. It was another language, the language of humanity over ideology. Meanwhile, in larger cities like Berlin, American and British women played crucial administrative roles during occupation. They supervised welfare distribution, documented war crimes, and managed the care of displaced persons. Female German clerks working under them experienced a kind of awakening. One noted in her diary, "Their confidence is frightening. They do not act as if they must prove themselves. They simply are." The power of that quiet confidence resonated even beyond the camps. As German civilians began rebuilding, many young women who had once served the Reich now found themselves working under Allied administration. They learned English, handled supplies, and observed firsthand how differently these societies treated women. The ideological divide that had seemed eternal was now visibly false. There was a moment, small but unforgettable, that captured this transformation. In a camp near Regensburg, An American WWII sergeant inspected a group of captured German auxiliaries for relocation. One of the German women, a former SS communications clerk, stepped forward and asked hesitantly, "Why do your men listen to you?" The sergeant paused, then replied simply, "Because I do my job." The German stood silent. That sentence, plain, practical, undeniable, stayed with her for the rest of her life. It was the end of the old myth. Nazi Germany had built its identity on domination, of nations, of races, and of women. Its defeat had been military, but its unraveling was ideological. The collapse of its worldview was happening not in speeches or tribunals, but in everyday acts, in women leading with competence, in equality seen rather than preached. By the summer of 1945, as camps began to dissolve and prisoners were repatriated, many German women carried home more than rations and papers. They carried questions. Questions about the lives they had been denied, about the strength they had mistaken for weakness. For years they had been told that freedom would destroy them, but they had seen the opposite. Freedom gave strength form, in posture, in speech, in calm authority. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, former German auxiliaries described that period not only as defeat, but as revelation. "It was the first time," one wrote, "that I saw a woman look at a man as her equal." Another said, "They were victorious because they respected themselves. We were defeated because we did not." Even the American women, many of whom returned home to face renewed expectations of domesticity, carried something irreversible back with them. They had led, commanded, and endured. They knew what they were capable of. The world might ask them to forget, but history would not. For the German captives, the war had ended with surrender. For the Americans, it had ended with proof. And in that brief intersection, that moment when captor and captive stood face to face, a new chapter of human identity began. It was not written in treaties or politics, but in presence. In the way one woman's confidence could undo another's conditioning, in how defeat could become awakening, and in how, amid the ruins of empire, the first signs of equality emerged. Quietly, irreversibly, in the gaze between women who had once stood on opposite sides of war. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, the world was a wreck of smoke, silence, and shifting power. Allied troops moved through cities reduced to ash, collecting not just prisoners and documents but stories, fragments of lives caught between loyalty and survival. Among them were thousands of German women, no longer soldiers or auxiliaries, simply survivors in uniforms that no longer held meaning. They were scattered across the ruins of camps, hospitals, and requisitioned schools, watched over by a new kind of authority. The men wore khaki, the women too, and it was those women, walking confidently among the debris of a defeated empire, who left the deepest mark. At first, the occupation was defined by necessity, feeding the hungry, restoring order, preventing revenge. Yet beneath those efforts ran a quieter transformation. For the German women who had served the Reich in offices, hospitals, and propaganda bureaus, captivity became education. Every interaction with an American or British woman chipped away at years of indoctrination. The Nazi ideal of feminine submission, repeated in classrooms and rallies, began to look hollow beside the calm command of a WWII officer or the competence of a Red Cross nurse. For many, this discovery was more destabilizing than defeat itself. Reports from POW facilities and occupation zones reveal how often German women remarked on the self-assurance of their Allied counterparts. One military psychologist recorded that female German prisoners seemed simultaneously resentful and admiring of the American women's bearing. They associated it with power, something they were never permitted to imagine for themselves. Some whispered that these women must be arrogant, unfeminine, or even dangerous, but those judgments faded as daily exposure revealed something simpler. These women were confident because they were trusted to act, decide, and lead. In the months that followed, the same realization spread beyond the camps and into the civilian population. When Allied women distributed food, taught hygiene, or administered welfare offices, they carried with them a quiet lesson about modernity. In a society shattered by dictatorship, they became living proof of a different world, one where gender did not dictate destiny. For German women standing in ration lines or translating for Allied officials, That contrast was unforgettable. They looked at us as people, one former nurse recalled, not as decorations or servants. It was the first time in my life I felt seen. For the Americans, their task was logistical and moral. They were not sent to convert, but to stabilize. Yet their presence did what leaflets and lectures could not. It modeled the democracy Germany had been told to despise. And it did so through small human acts. When a WWII corporal spoke to a captured German woman without condescension, when an American nurse handed bandages to a woman once considered the enemy, when an officer took a German secretary's opinion seriously, these were quiet revolutions. They carried no banners, no proclamations, but they rewrote ideas that propaganda had carved deep into people's minds. Meanwhile, the propaganda posters that once celebrated submission were being torn down or burned by Allied authorities. The images of idealized mothers and obedient daughters, smiling beneath the swastika, were replaced by silence, then by the reality of hunger and ruin. Yet in that void, the presence of women with authority filled the air like a new kind of poster, one that could not be destroyed. Some of the German captives were released within weeks, others months. Many returned to towns that no longer existed. When they spoke about their experiences in the camps, their tone often shifted from bitterness to bewilderment. They talked less about punishment and more about discovery, about how the Americans and British had treated them without the cruelty we expected. One woman, who had served as a propaganda typist in Berlin, said later, "They were free in a way we had never understood. Their confidence was not defiance, it was normal." That sentence captured the essence of what had changed. For the Americans, too, the end of the war brought reflection. The women who had commanded, driven trucks, and operated command posts across Europe now faced a return to civilian life. In their own country, millions would soon be told to go back home, to yield their jobs to returning soldiers. Yet the war had altered them. They had proven themselves capable in ways no one could deny. Some resisted being sent back into domesticity. Others quietly carried the memory of freedom into their families, their communities, and their daughters' futures. The confidence that had unsettled the German captives would become the foundation of the next generation's push for equality. In post-war Germany, that influence took root slowly. The surviving auxiliaries, nurses, and civilians who had witnessed Allied women in command began to speak differently about their own roles. Many who once saw obedience as virtue started questioning it. In the rubble years that followed, these same women became teachers, secretaries, and clerks in the rebuilding of their nation, roles once restricted by ideology. Their understanding of womanhood had changed, and so had their ambitions. Sociologists studying post-war Germany have noted that this period marked the first real shift in female consciousness within the country. It wasn't just the absence of men that forced women into public life. It was the model they had witnessed from across the ocean. The sight of American women driving convoys, managing aid, and speaking with authority left an imprint deeper than propaganda could erase. When West Germany later adopted its new constitution in 1949, granting full equality under the law, the seeds of that idea had already been planted, not in conference rooms, but in the ruins of 1945. The same was true for the Americans. Though many of their wartime gains were rolled back in the years after, the legacy of service endured. The Women's Army Corps was made permanent in 1948, and the presence of women in uniform became normalized. Those who had walked through the rubble of Europe with clipboards and courage carried an unspoken pride. They had proven that competence knew no gender. They had not only helped win a war but also shaped the meaning of victory itself. The personal stories that emerged years later reveal how deeply this encounter transformed individuals. A former German auxiliary named Anneliese wrote decades after the war, "I remember her, the American lieutenant who told us where to go, her voice steady, her hands sure. She was younger than me. I hated her that day, but I envied her too. She did not fear the world." Another woman, who had worked as a nurse in a Luftwaffe hospital, said simply, "They had freedom in their eyes." Those memories lingered long after the war faded into history books. They became part of the unspoken education that shaped the new Europe. When the Marshall Plan began and Western democracy rebuilt the continent, it wasn't only material aid that restored faith. It was example. The confidence, respect, and equality embodied by Allied women had shown a defeated people what a free society looked like in motion. The aftermath of the war was not only political, it was personal. Every woman who had seen another live without fear carried that image inside her. It changed how she walked, how she spoke, how she raised her children. And in that way, the quiet revolution continued long after the guns had fallen silent. By the early 1950s, a new generation of German girls was growing up under very different values, in schools that encouraged learning, ambition, and voice. They were the daughters of those who had seen the war's end and the American women who walked through it. When asked decades later about what had changed, one historian wrote, "Freedom arrived not as an army but as an attitude. The American women had not come to preach equality. They had simply lived it. And in doing so, they gave the defeated a glimpse of the world that could exist beyond submission and control. The ruins of the Reich became the classroom of democracy. And for the women who had once believed obedience was strength, that lesson was both humbling and liberating. It taught them that dignity could survive defeat, if it was rooted in respect, not fear. From those ashes, a new understanding of womanhood began to take shape, fragile but unstoppable. The old world had fallen, and with it, the illusion that power belonged only to men. The women of both nations, captives and victors alike, carried forward the truth they had seen, that freedom once witnessed could never again be unseen. In the end, what began as occupation became revelation. The women who had once stood on opposite sides of a brutal war came to represent two different worlds, one built on obedience, the other on freedom. In the shattered remains of the Third Reich, it wasn't tanks or treaties that shifted the future of Europe, but quiet human examples, women walking with dignity through destruction, proving that strength could exist without cruelty. For the German captives, the shock of seeing women in command had started as humiliation, but with time that humiliation turned into reflection. They had witnessed a society where confidence wasn't punished, where voice wasn't weakness, and where respect flowed from competence, not submission. They saw that freedom did not make women careless. It made them capable. That realization would echo through their lives, into the daughters they raised and the culture that slowly rebuilt itself from rubble. For the American women, their presence in Germany had been an assignment, not a crusade. Yet without intending to, they had become symbols, not of conquest but of possibility. In their calm authority, they revealed what democracy looked like when lived, not preached. They became, for those who watched them, the living proof that equality was not theory, it was action. Years later, as peace settled and nations rebuilt, the memory of that spring of 1945 remained like a faint echo across generations. It was the moment when the defeated saw the future in the faces of their captors, not through speeches or punishments, but through posture, kindness, and confidence. The war had taken everything, but it had left behind a truth too powerful to destroy. Freedom is not the absence of control, it is the presence of self-respect. And in that truth, born quietly among barbed wire and ruins, the modern idea of womanhood, unbound, equal, and human, took its first undeniable breath.